Welcome back to the Britt Mayer Show. I'm Britt Mayer. I am your host. And most importantly, I am a wife and a mom. And I am also raising young kids in this overwhelming culture. Today, we are tackling something that every parent must hear. Our kids are facing a mental health crisis that is exploding. Persistent sadness is hitting 4 in 10 high schoolers. Antidepressant prescriptions for youth surging post-pandemic is at an all-time high, especially among teen girls. And now graphic 4K videos of real violence, like the viral footage of Charlie Kirk's assassination in 2025, spread across screens in seconds, triggering trauma that most of us aren't equipped to handle. Schools are pushing quick meds, social media is flooding developing brains with disturbing content, and a system that often reaches for pills before addressing root causes is accelerating. And that's why I am so grateful to have Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring on the show. He's a board-certified psychiatrist, former FDA medical officer in psychiatry, and he is the founder of TaperClinic, which is the largest practice in the world dedicated to safe psychiatric drug tapering and de-prescribing. He has seen the system from the inside. He's questioned the quote-unquote science and the myths, and now he helps people, especially young people, come off meds that can do more harm than good. His recent videos and interviews are waking people up to the risks of SSRIs, the dangers of digital trauma, and real paths to healing without endless pills. This is such a good conversation for you parents. Please like, please subscribe, and share this with all of your parent friends because we're diving into the deep end on this. So with no further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring. Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring, did I pronounce it correctly?
You got it. You got it.
Good. We worked on this in the green room. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Britt.
This is going to be a very in-depth conversation, and it's really necessary because I am a parent, as I said in the intro, and this is something that obviously concerns me specifically for our kids and just the data that we are seeing with kids on SSRIs, and we're going to get into all of that. But I wanted to first start this. I gave you a little soft intro, but I would love for you to just tell the audience who you are and how you found yourself in this conversation.
Sure. So I'm a board-certified psychiatrist. So that means I'm a medical doctor that did subspecialty training in mental health conditions. And I think I'm most well-known now for being a fierce critic of the overuse of psychiatric medications, which really puts me at odds with my profession, which loves to put people on medications at the moment. How I ended up here was a couple of things. I think, the quick way of saying it is I went into into mental health with a very broad view of it. I knew that relationships were important. I knew meaning was important. I knew that physical health was important, all of these things. But when I started my training, I saw that because of the mental health economics, doctors were really only given we could only see about 3 to 4 patients in an hour, and to make ends meet. That's just how the economics were working. And because of that, we really shied away from doing a more holistic view on mental health. We wouldn't spend that much time really getting to the root of where, the depression or the anxiety was coming from. We would fall back on checklists saying, oh, well, they've got these 5 out of 9 symptoms. They have anxiety and depression, as if that sort of explained what was going on. And also, instead of maybe helping people with more non-drug approaches to mental health, we relied heavily on medications. And that just intuitively seemed off to me because mental health symptoms, they come from somewhere. There is a root cause for them. They're not chemical imbalances in the brain, but we were essentially just masking over symptoms with drugs. And so I ended up leaving my residency having a lot of questions about these medications. And essentially, whenever I would bring them up with my professors, they would say, don't worry, Josef, the drugs are safe and effective. The FDA has approved them. And I realized that I really didn't have a good understanding of the science behind these medications. And so I dedicated the next chapter of my career to drug research. And so I worked in the pharmaceutical industry. I was at Johnson & Johnson's pharmaceutical branch, Janssen. And then I went into the FDA, where I got to work in the division of psychiatry, looking at the safety and the effectiveness data of the medications. And what I saw there just shocked me, because I found out that the evidence base supporting these medications was incredibly thin, and that we had been overstating how safe and effective these drugs were, namely that none of the drugs are studied any longer than a year, so we really don't know what happens to people long-term on them. And that left a real sour taste in my mouth, and so I ended up leaving that behind and opening a practice about 5 years ago, where I now specialize in the non-drug approaches to mental health conditions, and I help people safely come off medications, because I think that's the way to better and more sustainable mental health.
Gosh, I'm so interested in all of this. And it's so cool to have a conversation with someone who has literally been in the belly of the beast. You've seen it from the academic perspective, you've seen it from the testing, the data-driven perspective, you've seen it from the lack thereof. So this is why I wanted to have you on, because I think it's a conversation that has started to grow, but not nearly loud enough. So let's just start first with defining SSRIs and what they truly are, what they actually do, because I think a lot of us don't even know how to categorize what an SSRI is. So why don't we start there?
So an SSRI it's the most popular type of antidepressant medication used in the United States right now, and it acts by modulating serotonin in the brain. It increases the level of serotonin there. And that creates a drug effect that is one of emotional blunting or numbing. And so they're commonly used in anxiety and depression for that effect.
Let's go a little bit deeper, because talking about the boosting of serotonin, I have so many questions. My brain works rapid fire, so I'm already connecting this to the
Sure.
dopamine response with social media. So I want to just talk about that, the boosting serotonin aspect of it, or blunting emotion aspect.
Mhm.
That's the intention, right? But we are seeing this widely prescribed to youth today. And you said, when you were explaining where you come from, that there's really a lack of evidence-based, true, rigorous scientific studies in regards to this, and anything past a year. So while we're saying that, yes, it's blunting and numbing, what else does that do? If it's blunting, if it's numbing,
Yeah.
if it's artificially boosting serotonin, but clearly there's something going on if that's not happening normally, then what else? What's the other hand in that with when people are taking these SSRIs?
So, well, I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about where the use of these drugs come from, because they come from something called the chemical imbalance theory of depression. So, for a really long time, and this goes back to the 50s when we discovered the first antidepressant, ipranisib. This was a drug given to patients with tuberculosis. It was an antibiotic, and they noticed that it energized people.
Mm.
And so the researchers back then found that, they looked at this drug and they thought, well, okay, it's energizing these patients with tuberculosis. Maybe we can give it to some of our depressed patients and see what happens. And lo and behold, it sort of woke them up, and they became more energetic. They became less anxious as well. And then they studied the drug, and they found that it boosted neurotransmitters. Specifically, it boosted serotonin and a few others. And so then scientists said at the time, maybe, depression is a chemical imbalance. Now, that's one theory, but another way of looking at it is you just essentially found a drug that has a drug effect that's energizing and also reduces anxiety. But the better commercial narrative from that time onwards was that depression was due to a chemical imbalance caused by low serotonin, because it was easier to almost, it was a better story on the progress of science that we had found like a specific cure for depression. A slightly more cynical way of looking at that is also that a lot of people are a little skeptical about taking a drug if it's just masking symptoms. Because they like to think that we want to get to the problems underlying it.
Yes.
And, masking any symptoms with a drug doesn't seem like a good long-term approach for many. And so there's also this other side of it where doctors started comparing antidepressants to like insulin for diabetes, an analogy that really speaks to us, like we really understand the cause, and this is just correcting this little blip in our biology and bringing things back to normal. That's how people think about insulin and diabetes, and that was like kind of a safer narrative to sell these drugs around. Now, we never found the chemical imbalance at all, because we've looked at a lot of people with anxiety and depression, and we haven't seen that consistently there's any differences between serotonin levels there. That's why there's no blood tests in anxiety and depression, or brain scans or anything like that. Then they're not useful tools to diagnose the condition. And so, if these drugs aren't really fixing the chemical imbalance, then the question is, well, what are they doing? And what we do know by experience is that these drugs certainly have a drug effect. And that drug effect is one of, reducing anxiety, reducing depression. And if you are a person, or if you're a child who has a lot of, OCD type symptoms, you're very anxious about going to school, and this could be for a whole host of reasons. If you take a drug that essentially constricts your emotional range, kind of brings things down so the lows aren't as low and the anxiety isn't as low, isn't as high, you actually will experience that as being very therapeutic. And so that's why a lot of people will say, hey, this drug really helps. And they do in the short term in that way because it's a drug effect. But the problem with these medications is that because they are drugs, they end up having the same issues that all other drugs have, whether we look at like alcohol or things like that. Your body becomes tolerant to them over time. And so you can take this medication day in, day out. But what we see happening is over time, that effect wears off. And then to get that same drug effect, you need to go on higher and higher doses over time. And so and then eventually you max out on one dose, and then you need to get on another medication as well, to maintain the effect. And in this way, you end up with people on higher and higher doses of medications and more meds, sort of chasing this drug effect without ever really getting to the root problem.
So prior to the 50s, what were we doing? What was our treatment for people who would present with symptoms that now we would label as depression that's indicative of needing these SSRIs?
Well, we did a whole host of things. We used to have like sanitariums. The Quakers really were involved in like mental health care for a long time. Psychiatry. If we go back to the Middle Ages, people looked at depression and anxiety and mania as like demonic possession. It eventually changes over time. And then, we have Freud at the start of the 20th century. He starts to look at it as being kind of like repressed urges, and specifically repressed sexual urges as well, as these coming from like libidinous drives. And so they had this like talking therapy where you're meant to unearth, these repressed desires and live, in more alignment with what you want. So there was this whole like Freudian school, but then there was also like moral therapy, and people were saying, living in immoral ways, will lead to worse mental health. And some of this is where this whole idea of like stigma around mental illness comes from, because there were a lot of different opinions about anxiety and depression in the past, where people would say, well, he's anxious and depressed, that means he's an immoral person, or he's a bad person, or he's a weak person. They would kind of equate it back to that. And so for the most part, before the 50s, it really was psychotherapy. We weren't using drug interventions for mental health problems.
Overall, how effective was that in what you've studied in terms of that treatment? We weren't even going to go into the history in this interview, but I'm fascinated with it. So just with what you have studied and researched, was there any efficacy in how we did pursue the issue of mental health prior to the advent of antidepressants?
It's really hard to say because, the record keeping and the data collection to really look at like, how well these treatments did over time. That's something that really kind of takes off as we go into the 20th century. So, the 30s, 40s, 50s. And so before then, we're not really, recording as much in our medical journals to say. Um, Looking at things like depression, for instance, a lot of these things change over time. I mean, depression and anxiety, these weren't really treated by medical professionals
Hmm.
until like like the 50s, 60s, 70s. We start looking after it. Prior to the 50s, mental health professionals really only dealt with like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, oftentimes in asylums. And we do have some data about that actually, I believe, we were actually doing probably a better job with bipolar and schizophrenia back then than we do now, because a lot of the medications we use for that have such nasty side effects long term. And so, Britt, it's a little hard to say.
Yeah, it's very complex. It's interesting though that you have like just when in what you just told us, it's interesting to see that there was a shift as soon as it became medically available. It became there was something that we could medically treat this issue with. Then it shifted from religion, moral, psychotherapy into medical pills on demand in around the 50s. Now, you said something that was really interesting in the intro saying we don't have long term safety data, but we call it safe and effective. And even just with what you just shared, if you take, say mid 50s to now, we're what, 70 years maybe post the advent of antidepressant pills, maybe a little bit less. So that's really just one generation of long term studies, if the studies even really were rigorous. So, do you have concern just in the fact that we're in a very small time period since the advent of SSRIs to, and we'll get into the data to where we're at now?
I mean, I have a lot of concerns about our current model not really helping people. And by say what I mean when I say our current model, it's the fact that, most of our mental health care happens through family doctors. They're writing about, I think it's like 70% of our prescriptions come from just your family medicine clinic now. And it's often in these short 15-minute appointments, heavily drug focused, not a lot of therapy because, you know, access is harder, and it's also not really encouraged as much anymore. And when we look at the suicide rate over time, and this is really where the main concern comes from, I mean, the suicide rate has steadily just been increasing since the 90s. And if you look at the amount of people on antidepressant medication since then, it's also going up. And so we're in a situation now where, I mean, the suicide rate, I mean, that's like the main way you really evaluate how good is our mental health industry doing. And if we're just seeing it steadily rising over time, I think it's up like maybe 60% since the early 90s, kind of just ticking away.
Gosh.
We're not really doing an effective a job at treating people. Along
Hmm.
with the suicide rate going up, teen suicidality is up, disability is up, like mental health disability is up as well, and we have 5 times as many people on antidepressants than we did
Hmm.
in the early 90s. And so, I mean, there's a lot of signs that we're not heading in the right direction as a country.
There's this interesting quote, and it comes from the world of vaccines, for kids, but it's that correlation does not mean causation, but it demands investigation. And so just hearing that, there is a correlation we're seeing, but it doesn't necessarily mean causation, but something's going on. And so it should be really looked at. I just saw Dr. Means, Kate, is it Casey Means, who
Yes.
is okay? I just saw she was grilled this week for her position, and it was interesting. One of these crazy senators who was grilling her was saying that SSRIs should be just blanket, popped out to pregnant women and how dare you even question that. And I was just shocked, and this senator kept using safe and effective. They're safe and effective. I can't believe you wouldn't recommend that for pregnant women. But here we are 70 years into this great experiment. There's clearly something's happening. The data shows that. Just to go a little deeper into that, and you can correct any of this that you think should be corrected. But from my research, recent studies are showing that antidepressant dispensing rates for ages 12 to 25 rose about 66% from 2016 to 2022, accelerating even faster after COVID, that whole situation, up to 129% faster for teen girls ages 12 to 17, 56% faster for young women 18 to 25, and overall around 4.5% of that age group received them by 2022 with SSRIs dominant. Many are starting in their mid-teens, often 12 to 17, prescribed for depression, anxiety, OCD, or related issues that are arising from this alarming increase, this uptick in rates of quote-unquote sadness, suicidal ideations, all of those stats. So looking at those trends, and as a parent who is concerned about what we're seeing and the widespread and rising alarm of our kids' mental health, and then them also using SSRIs, what should we know about all of this?
I think the first thing that every parent needs to know is that your child is more likely to have a suicide attempt if you put them on an antidepressant than a placebo. And this isn't some like fringe science. This is plastered all over the drug labeling for them. When the FDA has done analyses on this, on individuals under age 25 on these drugs, you're essentially twice as likely to have a suicide attempt if you're on the drug. This is like perfect research conditions. Hypothetically, 100 people get put on the drug and followed for 3 months. 100 people get put on placebo, followed for 3 months. Although that group on the drug seems to have a slightly lower score on the depression scale, which is what you want, they have more suicide attempts. And so
Wow.
the question is, why is that happening?
Yes.
And what we believe is going on is that, these are drugs just like any other drug. Some people will have paradoxical side effects. What I liken it to is like you could have 10 people in a room smoking a joint. 9
Hmm.
people are giggling, having a good time. One person becomes paranoid. The same happens with psychiatric medications. There are just certain brains that do not respond well to the drugs. And in those individuals, if they're already depressed and you give them something that they have a bad reaction to, it will make them more depressed. It will make them more anxious. It will make them have, more obsessive, dark thoughts. And we actually believe that it's those adverse reactions in that group that are driving people to have a higher rate of suicide. So what I want all parents to know is sometimes like antidepressants get pushed in these visits because the doctors don't have a lot of time and they're just like,
Hmm.
well, I could give you an antidepressant. And the parents think this is like the better safe than sorry approach. Better be safe than sorry. Need to put my child on the antidepressant. It's not. It's actually the more reckless position, because the thing that people care about, much more than lower symptoms on a depression scale, are suicides and suicide attempts. And so, if you are under age 25, antidepressants should be the absolute last resort, Hail Mary attempt to get their mental health under control. Because on average, the outcomes that you actually care about are worse on the antidepressants.
My gosh, I would think that the whole audience jaw just dropped with that because I didn't even know that. So what is that? Why would it be that we're seeing a more increase in suicide attempts or suicide um, with kids who have been put on? Is there something that it does to the brain that then allows them to push through and actually go forward with things that otherwise would have been restrained? Like, what is the science for that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different theories around this. So one is, like I mentioned, you can have adverse reactions that make
Hmm.
someone more depressed. If that happens in someone who's already suicidal, like that's really dangerous. Sometimes these drugs make people manic and psychotic. That's a rare adverse reaction that can also push them into to doing things like suicide. Some people also believe that the blunting effect of the drug can lead to an apathy. So let's say you've already decided that you want to take your life. Now you get put on a drug that's really blunting. Maybe in the past you would have said, I'm never going to end my life because this would devastate my family. Now you just don't care as much. It's kind of just like that fear of death or the fear of the consequences from your family can go away as well. And so I think there's, a whole host of ways that these drugs may, in vulnerable individuals, actually, push them that way.
If you are anything like me, you are so tired of companies that continually push woke nonsense, and you are actively looking for companies that are patriotic. So enter Resistance Candles. They are hand-poured candles right here in the USA by true patriots who stand for liberty and tradition. They've got an amazing collection. I burn them all the time, and their newest release is Liberal Tears. It's a perfect mix of salty liberal tears and bitter black coffee beans. Can you smell it now? They are premium wax blends with a clean burn. They are long-lasting, and they are loaded with defiant freedom energy. These make an ideal gift, one for you, and buy several to pass along to fellow patriots this year. So head to resistancecandles.com and use code RootedWings for your exclusive discount, because supporting American-made should come with perks. Go grab those Liberal Tears candles now at resistancecandles.com. So I'm just going to straight shoot ask you the connection with SSRIs and school shootings. I want to know what we're seeing, what the data is showing with the connection with these. We are seeing an uptick in this, in violence, in young kids, in just becoming unhinged, unglued, detached from reality, and then going in and shooting up a school. So is there a legitimate connection, and something that we as parents need to be aware of, with a connection to SSRIs and violence such as school shootings?
Yeah, so it's a complicated issue where the data is kind of poor. So gun ownership in the US. This is the first thing, because a lot of people are just like, it's the guns. Gun ownership in the US has stayed the same. Going back about I feel like it's like 70 years since they started tracking it. It sits around 55%. It's between 50 and 60%. We've always had guns in our homes. But then we start to see in the 90s and then going into the 2000s and after that, we see this increase in these random acts of violence, like mass, high trauma violence in schools. And so what people started to notice was a lot of these school shooters, they were on psychiatric medications. And so the question was, is this correlating? And, obviously starting in 1988, Prozac comes onto the market, and then we have this boom in the use of these drugs where, for a long time, about 5% of children are on antidepressants. Now, since the pandemic, it's slightly higher, as you had mentioned previously. And the truth is, we do not know, we do not have any good data right now that can draw the link between those two things. But what we do have is our case reports. So what we do know is that some individuals who got put on these medications went on to do mass acts of violence. And so this is like Joseph Westbecker. He got put on Prozac. This is an adult. He went and shot up a whole printing press workplace. We have Donald Shell, who, and this case also went to trial. He was on Paxil. He had a severe adverse reaction to it. He killed his wife, his daughter, and his granddaughter. There was a $6 million judgment against SmithKline because they found that the drug was responsible and they had failed to warn. There's the case of the Aurora shooter, James Holmes, where there is really solid evidence there. This was the Batman shooting. I think he killed over 10 people in a cinema. There was really good evidence that he was put on Zoloft, and then the dose was increased, and it sent him into a manic episode. And a few weeks after that, he went and killed all the people in the cinema. And so right now, it's, how much of this is social contagion, because we talk about it in the news a lot. I think that's possible. Obviously there's an access to gun issue. If you have guns in the household, it's easier to get them. but it can also be driven by impulsivity from the psychiatric medications. Now, the only way we're really going to get to the bottom of this potential public health problem is if we actually start doing interviews of people when these events happen. And so if there is a mass shooting and the person survives, you need to interview the person, you need to interview their family, were they put on medications, and did their behavior change? Do they have a history of violence in the past? And if you start to get these narratives like, hey, this person, they got put on the drug, their behavior drastically changed, which is what happened to James Holmes, and then this mass act of violence happens, then there's a pretty good case that it was drug-induced. And so we actually we need to start there at that spot now and start looking into all these events to see if there's a causal link at the individual case level.
Is there any work being done right now to that effect? Do you know if RFKJ, HHS, is this something that they are actively invested in looking into?
My understanding is that, yes, they are looking into this, and they are looking into it at the level of the individual.
Because as a mom, from my perspective, I'm just going to be very blunt. I see this generation of kids really starting in, at 85 when we had the liability, was it 85 or 84? The liability shield went on pharmaceuticals with childhood vaccines. So, and I don't know if you and I agree on all of this, but I have serious concerns about that generation. So really ours and then the coming generation being just a lab rats to a medical industrial complex where you have kids receiving so many childhood vaccines in such a short period of time that we have no longevity studies as to that amount of stuff being shot into kids. Then on top of that, you have the trans agenda being pushed into kids. So then you have kids going in for cross-sex hormones on top of the childhood vaccines. Okay, so now you have number two. A lot of those end up on surgery tables with body parts being cut off and then put on more drugs to keep their body as healthy as possible post-surgery. A lot of those kids are depressed. So then you have kids put on antidepressants. All of this is just a cocktail being shot up into our children from birth on. And I want that studied. I want to know what the heck are we doing to our kids and why.
Yeah. Yeah. And, to add to that list of issues, I mean, some researchers think that it's 9% of kids born in America these days are born to mothers on antidepressants. And so we also know from studies, there's been 12 MRI studies now, that if you conceive a child on antidepressants and carry that baby, that their brains look different when they're born. And then when you follow these kids up long-term into adolescence, they actually have altered emotional processing. And when we do these studies as well with rats, where we take rats and we expose one cohort to antidepressants during gestation to another, they grow up and they show autistic-like behaviors and decreased sexual and mating behaviors as well. And so we also have this whole other issue going on where, a decent proportion of our population are being born under the influence of drugs during this very delicate developmental stage. And I mean, you're totally right. I mean, with the vaccine issue, I can't pretend to understand all of the science, but I can see it in front of my own eyes. I feel like it's like 1 in 20 kids have autism now. I can see it in the children of my friends and the children at school, that there's so many kids who are having these problems now. And then when you look at the Amish communities and there's like no autism there at all, it's like, okay, so maybe there's something to the fact that we are injecting kids with all of these different things that seem to modulate their immune system. And yes, I get there's some benefit to some of these vaccines, but we need to look at how we're doing it. And then, I mean, the whole issue with the transgender stuff as well, it's, I did an analysis recently after that Canadian transgender individual shot up the school. And I went back 10 years and I looked at all school shootings where 3 or more people were shot. And 25% of them were by transgender individuals. And, this is a group that makes up at most 1% of the population. And to have them represented in a quarter of these school shootings, again, it's like you said, we need the research on this because I think there's bound to be consequences of, one, they take a lot of psychiatric medications. It's a very
Mhm.
persecuted population. They're on cross-sex hormones that alter things. Um, Three, I also think they're being betrayed to and lied to by a very progressive arm of medical professionals who, rather than really getting to the root of what's going on with these individuals, I feel like they just tend to cheerlead them onto cross sex hormones
Yes.
or surgeries because they want to advocate for a cause rather than being like, okay, maybe there's other things going on than you not being a different gender. I don't
Mhm.
think they do that, and so I'm right there with you, Britt. I share a lot of concerns about
Mhm.
what we're doing, and I think there's a big betrayal going on at the moment.
Gosh, it's so frustrating to be from this place as a mom, and just want to demand like this is not okay. Something the kids are not okay. Something is wrong. The data is showing us that our children are the most unhealthy they've ever been in American history. What is going on? And why are we not forcing the hand of, I don't care how big medical industrial complex and the pharmaceutical industrial complex and all of that is, like, we as moms and parents, we have a voice in this, and to demand rigorous investigation so that our children and our grandchildren and our future is healthy. Like, and it's very, very frustrating to feel like it's just a runaway train. Let's talk a little bit before we get into the options outside of SSRIs. I do want to really focus on boyhood and girls because they're very different. So I'm a mom of a boy and a girl, so I come at it from both places. This one hits close to home. ADHD diagnoses have become almost, as you would know, a rite of passage for American boys. Nearly 1 in 4 teen boys by age 17, with over 1 million more kids diagnosed since 2016. That is just so crazy. And many of those boys end up on stimulants or SSRIs for anxiety, depression. Critics are arguing that modern education, sedentary classrooms, rigid structures, less recess and play, mismatched with boys' higher energy and movement needs, could be pathologizing normal boyhood behavior, which is leading to, the quote unquote need for uh, medication. But I want your perspective on this, and especially when it comes to boys. How much is the school environment turning active, energetic boys into quote unquote problems that then get medicated rather than looking at, are we doing this wrong for boys? Are we actually causing the problem that then we are going in and medicating?
So wh- I think, it's definitely to me much more complicated than this kid just has a brain problem. Like, with there's so many different ways to look at this. So, yes, I think some classrooms are boring, and I think boys need to run around more. I think they develop slower than girls. They have a harder time staying in their seat. Some of it is a maturity issue. I mean, research shows time and time again that if you are born towards the end of your age cohort, you are much more likely to be put on stimulants for ADHD than those who are born, right at the cutoff,
Mm,
suggesting that we're just medicating immaturity. I also think that, um, and this is a hunch that's not backed up by any research that I've seen. I mean, I also wonder about like vaccines as well. I mean, if there is something about these medications that's causing some neurodevelopmental problems and hyperactivity and mild aggression and things like that, that's also going to manifest with ADHD type symptoms. And when you're a parent and you're struggling to keep your kid in school, I mean, the solution is going to be, a stimulant to sort of suppress the behavior. When you get to older kids, the use of stimulants, I think, kind of shifts a little bit from like, hey, this kid is kind of aggressive and he keeps on getting out of his seat, to more being like performance enhancing drugs, where
mm.
kids will fake ADHD symptoms in order to get prescriptions of Adderall,
Wow.
um, because they think it's helpful. Now, I mean, if there was one thing that I'd want parents to know about ADHD medications is in the short run, they do help with behavioral control. That's what the largest MTA study on Ritalin found. But by 3 years on the drug, there was no difference in behavioral control between the group on the drug and the group off the drug. So these stimulants are really for short-term behavioral control. Many parents feel like that there's like an academic boost to these medications, and if you take stimulants, you're going to perform, you're going to get better grades, you're going to have a better career, you'll go to a better college. Research has never found that. They've never found that taking stimulant medication actually improves academic performance, not in the short run and not in the long run. Now, so they really are behavioral control meds. And then the final thing is that stimulants, they can impair your sleep. They can also lead to anxiety disorders. And I've also seen some kids become even more aggressive on stimulants. They carry warnings for that. And then they get misdiagnosed with things like bipolar disorder.
Mm.
And so, yeah, there's a lot of concerns with the overuse of these meds.
That's specific, obviously, girls included, but really with boys. Everything you just shared is so, like, as a mom of a boy, I hear that in a different lens than I would with my daughter. Now, with my daughter, one of the concerns I would have, and my daughter actually is not on any screens. We're going back to like 1990 in my household. So we watch family movies, but there are no iPhones, none of that. And she knows that that's just off the table. But one of my concerns for girls is two-pronged, is social media with over-medication. I was thinking as I was preparing for this interview, and it was one of the earliest thoughts I had about the Charlie Kirk assassination, was how many kids witnessed that, the trauma of that, something that kids are not built or prepared to see in real time, again and again and again. I mean, it was just nonstop in the feed, very gruesome and graphic. So that the digital trauma that comes from just this world we live in now with our digital era, and then also the comparison factor combined with AI on social media, and every girl in America is on social media. Walk us through that as moms who have daughters. What should we be aware of? And then you can also link in birth control as a gateway to
Sure. Yeah.
anti-anxiety, which is fascinating. And I'd love for you to just kind of talk about all of that specifically for parents who have daughters.
Sure. So I think that social media is one of the biggest risks to the mental health of young girls. And I mean, this is borne out in the research. They've looked at how social media use correlates with worsening depression and anxiety, and it always affects girls more than boys. And that's because, I mean, boys are on YouTube, they're looking at like sports and things like that, or how-to videos. You go to girls, they're, posting, a lot of the times they're posting selfies of themselves, or they're looking at, photoshopped images of celebrities who have really, bodies that they're not real, or they're living a life that is completely out of reach to them. The amount of time that girls spend on social media, especially teen girls, it's about 3.5 hours a day when we look at it on average. And so that's 3.5 hours that has been removed from other things that used to be better for your mental health, hanging out with your friends in person, sleeping, being physically active or doing sports. Instead, it's now, essentially on like Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is, being influenced by that content there. And I mean, the overwhelming message that you are going to get a lot of the time is that the most important thing about me is how I look. The most important thing is, am I at this cool party or that cool party?
Mm-hmm.
And it's constantly just like, making you feel worse about yourself.
So much pressure. So much pressure to perform and to be someone that you can never be. I can't imagine being a girl in this era today. I don't, it's a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, if we go, I mean, the internet is very dangerous. I mean, but also for boys as well. I mean, this is a place where a lot of kids, they spend a lot of time, and they can also get, like, in some ways, like, radicalized as well. I mean, when we look at, whether it's school shooters or, I mean, even the individual that killed Charlie Kirk, I mean, there was all of these conversations on whether it was Reddit or Discord in these dark corners of the internet where people are just saying awful things to each other, really antisocial stuff. And so it's like, why would you give your child access to, this device where they can kind of go online and they can get influenced by all of these antisocial people like lurking in these different forums? I mean, it's not a good idea to give your kids unfettered access to the internet. I mean, you really have to talk to them about that. Um, I think about social media and how it's just this constant fire hose of influence into kids, and also just the decline of really religion as well. I mean, if we go back to the 70s, 50% of American households are going to church on a regular basis. That's down 20%. But this was a place where we used to get our moral education. In many schools, that's been removed as well. And so we don't have this traditional moral education about, where a child might hear, instead of, hey, it's all about your looks and how much money you make, they might hear, well, it's about wisdom, well, it's about starting a family, it's about living a life in service of others. I mean, there used to be many healthier messages for the youth about what really mattered, which is now just being replaced by whatever slop is getting fed up to you by the algorithm. So that's a big, yes, that's a big concern. Shifting gears to talk about the oral contraceptive pill, Britt, it's, it is one of the most, under-recognized causes of mood instability that I've seen. Many people will say, okay, maybe the oral pill, that's the one I need to worry about because it's systemic, but I'm taking the Mirena and that's just, it's just local. It's just in my uterus. That's not going to cause problems. The data doesn't show that. The data shows that there's actually more mood instability and depression and anxiety for people who get things like the Implanon or the patch or the Mirena, because they live in the body. Consistently. And so if you get on one of these on one of these hormonal birth controls that stay in you, and even the ones that you cycle on and off, you can start to develop depressive and anxious symptoms. And many doctors, they will not recognize this, and then they will say you have like a depression or anxiety, and then they'll put your child on like an SSRI. And obviously that's a problem because they're still being exposed to this chemical, which is destabilizing their mood. So my message to parents is, if you have a young girl, I mean, if we think about it, like for acne, don't put them on the pill. Do a dietary intervention and exercise. Both of them have been shown in randomized controlled trials to do great things for the skin, and it's not a chemical. If it's for painful periods, again, dietary interventions and exercise are really helpful there. Painful periods are generally a sign of like inflammation in the body. And again, taking a pill to kind of stop the periods, that's not a natural way of dealing with that. I mean, if you're a younger person, like if it's being used for contraception, you can use the copper IUD, and there's other methods. There's condoms. There's things like there's the calendar method as well. If you trust your partner a lot, there are just other ways to treat a lot of the issues apart from taking a drug that dysregulates your hormones and can lead to all of these mental health problems.
So obviously, just with the background of everything we just talked about, we have a storm being waged, I would say a full-on war being waged on so many fronts against our children and our kids' futures, because this does affect them, like we've talked about. It's going to affect them as parents, as being able to be happy in their future and seek out success and be highly functioning adults. And that's a concern for me as a mom, and I know so many of my listeners. So we've seen all the correlation of there's so many factors in all of this, and we aren't going to solve it overnight. But what we really have been grounding this conversation in is that in spite of all of these things being hurled at our kids, the antidote is just pop a prescription on the kid, give them an SSRI, make them happy, give them a pill. And the reality is that that is not helping our children long term, and that there's just too little scientific evidence to really be able to emphatically say that those are safe and effective, like a lot of doctors will tell parents when they're in that room. So, in light of all of this, I want you to walk us through what's the alternative? What does the alternative look like? How do we make our kids healthy? How do we address this at a base root level so that we aren't at a place where our kids are in a doctor's office being prescribed an SSRI?
Okay, yeah. So I like to think about it as in like a three-pronged approach. I mean, you need to look after the body, the mind, and the soul. And so when we talk about looking after the body, it's the idea that our brain lives within our physical body. If we don't look after our body, we're going to have mental health problems. And so what do you do for that? I mean, you want clean whole foods, you want to minimize processed foods, you want to nutrient dense foods. Like you simply just need that to have good mental health. Movement, our body is designed to move. We need to exercise. Staying at a healthy weight. I mean, if you're carrying a lot of extra weight, you're going to have more inflammation in your body as well. I think, for older children, it's really important to steer them away from overusing caffeine products, nicotine products, and even cannabis. All of those things can be really detrimental to your mental health. And also getting them away from social media. I mean, if you are at school all day and then you're coming home and then you're just on social media on the dopamine scroll, that may feel like that's a calming activity to the child, but it is not. It is a very stimulating activity. It's getting them ramped up. It's putting them into a hyper aroused state. It's going to lead to more anxiety. It's going to lead to more sleep problems. You want to replace that with really rejuvenating activities, whether that is nature walks, whether, time with loved ones, or even things like mindfulness, breath work. If you have a kid that's potentially into that, all of these things will kind of calm the body down and will help. The next thing to shift to is really the top-down approach, which is how do you manage your thoughts and emotions? And we have some of the best research here in any area of psychiatry. And while there are hundreds of different types of therapies, the one that I recommend are really the cognitive behavioral therapies, because these aren't the therapies where you're paying someone to be like your friend, or where someone spends all the time to just delve into your past and ask you about your childhood. These are problem-focused, skills-based therapies where you learn all of the skills to learn about your emotions, manage, negative thought patterns that you have. And these can be things like DBT. If you're having, really intense emotions, there's this specific things like prolonged exposure therapy for social anxiety. There's exposure response prevention for OCD. There are things like acceptance commitment therapy for anxiety and depression, and this is essentially emotional maturity. Like it's learning where your emotions come from and how to control them, and this can be life changing. And so that's a really great sort of like top down cognitive approach. If you think about the body as being the bottom up approach, which is calming the body, those two things together really help. Now, the last area, soul, like these are
Yeah.
really things that you need for, like, we're just wired for these things. Humans need them, and we can have great physical health and we can have great cognitive health, but if we miss these things, you can still be unhappy. And the first part of that, I think, is loving relationships. And so you need to look inside the household, like what is happening inside the home? What is the relationship like between the parents and the siblings? What are the relationships like for that child? Do they are things safe at home? Are these nurturing relationships? That needs to be taken care of. And then the second thing is having your child part of something that gives them a sense of meaning. This can be school sports, This could also be, hobbies, activities, maybe even academic things that they're really into. They need to feel engaged on a daily basis and, not just sitting around, but actually enjoying something. And I think if you can bring those three things together, um, a lot of the time that will really improve their mental health much more and in a much more sustainable way than just medications.
It's good. And you know what I like about what you just shared, that three-prong approach, is that we as human beings, we aren't just a brain. We aren't just a body. We aren't just soul. We are made with all of those things very connected. We're very interconnected. And then with personal relationships, there's that connection too. I have Pastor Johnny Arvanis coming on, I think next month, and he's going to talk about anxiety from a spiritual perspective, which I'm so excited to have our listeners listen to, because that's also a very, very important aspect of all of this. But it really does all feed together. It's not, you can't just separate the brain. We have everything else going on. So I think that's great for parents to hear that it's multifactorial, just as the war is against our kids. For kids and parents who have already been on, especially for parents who've already put their kids on SSRIs, and they're listening to this and thinking, oh my gosh, what have I done? I've ruined my kid. How do I get them off of this? What would you say to those parents who are already a little further down the path?
Well, what I would say is kids generally are the best group when it comes to tolerating SSRI withdrawal. They have very plastic brains. They seem to bounce back from withdrawal really well. But I would also say, I mean, you want to do it slowly. And so generally, what I recommend is dropping the dose by 5 to 10% every month. And you can either increase the rate or you can slow it down depending on how your child tolerates it. But what you don't want to do is just like pull it off in like a month or stop it cold turkey, because that can cause like a bad withdrawal reaction. Sometimes kids, they become a lot more depressed or anxious, sometimes even suicidal if it's really bad. And so you just want to ease them off the drug in a steady way that allows their brain to readapt to the absence of the drug without pushing them into a very severe withdrawal. A little bit of withdrawal is going to happen, but most kids tolerate it pretty well. I would recommend that you actually go and get a bit of an education on this. And I'm going to plug my own resource. If you go to my YouTube channel. Yeah, if you go to my YouTube channel, it's the Dr. Josef YouTube channel. That's Josef. It's spelt in the German way. We have videos on how to taper off antidepressants. And below all of our videos, we have a very comprehensive, it's a 5-hour long guide. It's completely free, and it tells you how to taper off every single psychiatric medication with your doctor. And so just getting that foundational education on that will put you in a much better and safer position if you want to support your child coming off medications.
You are doing the Lord's work in all of this. I'm so thankful for just how you have gone in head first to truly rescue the next generation. And I think your name's going to go down in history for all of your work that you have done. I really think that we are on the precipice of needing change, and you are leading the way. I'm so very thankful for you, and for you just continuing to dive into this topic and not letting up, because a lot of parents need help, and you're offering a path forward, and the education you provide is phenomenal. Yes, go check his YouTube. I'll have it linked in the show notes, along with a whole lot of other good stuff from Dr. Yseph. But before we wrap, I want you to tell parents again how they can find you, follow your work, and then even what you talked about with the resources. If a parent is saying, yes, I want to know more about that, what you were talking about with learning mature behavior. How do I get my kids synced up with a good psychiatrist who's not going to put them on the next round of drugs? Just share with parents how they can connect with you on all of those things. And then we'll close out this wonderful interview. And like I said, I could have had you on for another hour, because you're just, you're such a gift. So thank you so much, Dr. Yseph.
Sure. So the first place I would say is you can go to my website, which is taperclinic.com, and you could see whether our team is the right fit for you. If for whatever reason we aren't, if you go to the Contact Us section on my website, we have directories to different psychiatrists all around the world who specialize in drug tapering. If you, there's also a great website called Psychiatry Redefined. And if you go to the provider directory there, it's a list of integrative and holistic psychiatrists who generally have a non-drug approach to mental health problems first, and they're conservative on the meds. I'd recommend that as well. As for like cognitive behavioral therapy, we're really lucky that all of that is covered by insurance. And so what I would recommend is maybe you pull up ChatGPT and you plug in some of the symptoms that your child is having or you are having, and you say, what type of cognitive behavioral therapy is a good fit for this? They might say DBT. Call up the number on the back of your insurance card and just say, I'm looking for a DBT therapist in network. And you could actually get that covered fully by insurance. And so that's where I'd recommend that you go for those resources.
So wonderful. You are such a great help. And then, listeners, if today's episode hit home, if this was helpful for you, if you're a mom feeling the weight of protecting your kids from all these quick fix medications and protecting your kids from this war that is aimed at them, please don't keep this episode to yourself. Please like this, subscribe, share this with all of your mom groups, your friends, your church friends, all of your people, and let them know that you heard this conversation and that there was something worth sharing about it. And then please go follow Dr. Yseph and his incredible work in this arena, because he is really leading the charge. Thank you again so much, Dr. Yseph, for being with us today.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Britt.